Hey guys, tonight we begin a journey into one of history's most fascinating status symbols. Picture this. The year 802, somewhere in the heart of Europe, an elephant steps onto foreign soil for the first time in nearly 1,000 years. His name is Abulabas, a gift from the Caliph of Baghdad to Emperor Charlemagne. But here's the twist. Before Instagram had pet influencers flexing their exotic animals for likes and follows, European nobility were doing the exact same thing, except their followers were entire kingdoms, and their content could start wars or forge alliances. What if I told you that a single parrot knew more state secrets than most government officials? Or that an orangutan in a white dress dined at Napoleon's table with better manners than most guests? These weren't just pets. They were political weapons, symbols of power, and sometimes the strangest companions you could ever imagine. Now, before we explore this wild world together, I want to ask you something. If you're enjoying this journey into history's most unusual relationships, take just a moment to subscribe to the channel and hit that like button. But here's the thing, only do it if you genuinely find value in what we're discovering together. And I'm curious, where are you right now? Lying in bed? Sitting by a window? What time is it where you are? Drop a comment and let me know. I read every single one, and honestly, knowing you're out there listening makes these late-night storytelling sessions so much more meaningful. All right, let's dim those lights, maybe turn on a fan for that gentle white noise, and let me take you back to a time when owning the right animal could change your destiny. So let's start at the very beginning, because to understand why European nobility became obsessed with unusual pets, we need to understand what these animals really represented. You see, in medieval and Renaissance Europe, there was no internet, no television, no way to instantly broadcast your wealth and power to the world. So how did kings and emperors prove they were more powerful than their rivals? The answer was surprisingly simple. They collected things nobody else could have, and the rarest, most impressive thing you could possibly own, a living, breathing creature from the other side of the world. Think about it this way. In the modern world, if you want to show you're successful, you might buy a luxury car, a designer handbag, or maybe post photos from an expensive vacation. But imagine living in a time when most people never travelled more than 20 miles from their birthplace. Imagine never seeing a photograph, never reading a travel magazine. In that world, if someone told you about an animal with a neck as tall as a house, or a bird that could repeat human words, or a spotted cat that could run faster than a horse, would you believe them? Probably not. These animals were like mythical creatures stepping out of legends, and if a king could show you one in person, walking through his gardens, well, that king must truly rule the world. Charlemagne understood this better than almost anyone. When that elephant, Abulabas, arrived at his palace in Aachen in the year 802, it wasn't just a generous gift, it was a calculated political statement. The Caliph of Baghdad was saying, "Look how far my influence reaches. Look what I can send across deserts and mountains and seas." And Charlemagne was saying to every other European ruler, "Look what allies I have. Look what I can command." That elephant lived for 8 years, and during that time, he became more famous than most nobles. People would travel for weeks just to catch a glimpse of him. He was, in every sense, the first celebrity pet. But here's what makes this even more interesting. Abulabas wasn't Charlemagne's only exotic animal. The emperor had 3 entire menageries, collections of creatures that included lions, bears, camels, monkeys, and exotic birds. And he wasn't unusual in this. Owning exotic animals had become an arms race of prestige. If your neighbour had a lion, you needed 2 lions. If your rival had a monkey, you needed a cheetah. it was competitive, it was expensive, and it was absolutely essential if you wanted to be taken seriously. Now, let me paint you a picture of what these early menageries actually looked like, because they weren't like modern zoos. There was no concern for the animals' well-being, no attempt to recreate natural habitats. These were symbols, trophies, living proof of how far a ruler's power extended. Animals were often kept in small cages or chained in courtyards. They were brought out for special occasions like diplomatic visits or grand feasts, where they would be paraded around to impress guests. Imagine being a visiting ambassador and your host casually walks you past a full-grown lion. The message was clear. If I can control this beast, imagine what I could do to my enemies. William the Conqueror continued this tradition in England. Around the year 1100 he began a collection of exotic animals at his manor in Woodstock. His son, Henry I, expanded it even further, and then we have the Tower of London, which became home to one of Europe's most famous menageries. King John, who reigned from 1199 to 1216, kept lions and bears there. Can you imagine that? The Tower of London, that stern fortress we think of today, once echoed with the roars of lions and the growls of bears. Later, in 1235, Henry III received 3 leopards as a wedding gift from Frederick II, the Holy Roman Emperor. And here's a detail that will make you smile. A few years later, he received a white bear as a gift from the King of Norway, and this bear was apparently allowed to swim in the Thames River while attached to a long chain. Picture that for a moment. Medieval Londoners going about their business, and there's a polar bear splashing around in the river. But here's what I find most fascinating about these early collections. They weren't just about showing off. They were about demonstrating something deeper: control over nature itself. In medieval thinking, the world was a hierarchy. God was at the top, then angels, then humans, then animals. A king sat at the top of the human hierarchy, supposedly appointed by God. So if a king could command these wild, powerful animals, he was demonstrating that his authority came from the divine. He wasn't just powerful among men, he had power over creation itself, and the animals came from everywhere. Trade routes were expanding, exploration was increasing, and suddenly creatures that had only existed in travellers' tales were arriving in European ports. Elephants from India and Africa, lions from North Africa and the Middle East, monkeys from Africa and Asia, parrots from the Americas. Each animal told a story of connection, of trade networks, of naval power, of diplomatic relationships. When you owned a cassowary from Madagascar or a crocodile from Egypt, you were showing that your influence touched every corner of the known world. But let me tell you about one particular emperor who took this to an extraordinary level: Frederick II, Holy Roman Emperor in the 13th century. Frederick was absolutely obsessed with animals, and not just as status symbols. He was genuinely curious about them. He was a falconer, and he wrote one of the most important medieval treatises on falconry. But beyond birds, he collected everything. And when he got married, he didn't just have a typical medieval wedding procession. Oh no, he had cheetahs marching in the parade. Can you picture that? A royal wedding, all the pageantry and ceremony, and there are trained cheetahs walking alongside the nobles. It must have been absolutely breathtaking. People who witnessed it probably talked about it for the rest of their lives. The cheetahs, by the way, deserve their own conversation, and we'll get to them in more detail later, but I mention them here because they represent something crucial about how these animals functioned. Cheetahs were hunting companions for nobility in India, Persia, and eventually Europe. They were trained like falcons, hooded, and then released to chase down prey. Owning a cheetah wasn't just about having an exotic pet. It was about having a functional, useful creature that also happened to be devastatingly impressive. You were saying, I am so powerful that even the fastest land animal on Earth works for me. And this brings us to an important shift that happened around the 15th and 16th centuries. The Italian Renaissance changed how Europeans thought about animals. Instead of just being symbols of power or tools for hunting, animals began to be seen as objects of scientific curiosity. Wealthy families in Renaissance Italy started creating private menageries specifically to study animals, to understand them, to paint them accurately. Artists like Leonardo da Vinci sketched animals from life. Nobles would hire naturalists to care for and document their collections. The Villa Borghese in Rome, built between 1608 and 1628, featured extensive gardens with exotic animals that were as much about education as they were about prestige. But even with this new scientific interest, the competitive element never disappeared. In fact, it intensified. By the end of the 15th century, having a menagerie wasn't just something a king did, it was something every serious noble family aspired to. If you wanted to be invited to the right social circles, if you wanted marriages into powerful families, if you wanted political influence, you needed to demonstrate cultivation and worldliness. And nothing said worldly quite like a courtyard full of creatures from distant lands. The mortality rate for these animals was devastating. Most didn't survive the journey to Europe. Ships would leave African or Asian ports with dozens of animals, and only a handful would arrive alive. The conditions were terrible: cramped spaces, improper food, stress, disease. And even those that survived the voyage often didn't last long in European climates. Tropical birds would die in winter. Animals used to vast territories would sicken in small enclosures. But here's the thing that might surprise you. The high mortality rate actually made surviving animals more valuable. If 9 out of 10 elephants died on the journey, that one elephant that survived became priceless. Scarcity drove desire, and desire drove the trade. And it wasn't just the nobility acquiring these animals. The network of people involved was vast. Ship captains, merchants, trappers, handlers, translators, diplomats, all of them played a role. There were specialists whose entire career was travelling to foreign lands to capture specific animals for specific nobles. Nicolas Arnoux, for example, was appointed as the treasurer of the galleys in France specifically to manage animal acquisitions. His job was to coordinate shipments through the port of Marseille, to reduce mortality rates, to ensure that when King Louis XIV wanted an ostrich or a gazelle, Nicholas could deliver, and he wasn't alone. Men like Montgasson made around 40 trips to the Middle East and North Africa between 1671 and 1694, bringing back over 800 birds, including 103 ostriches, plus gazelles, goats, and sheep. Can you imagine that as your job description? Professional exotic animal procurement specialist. But here's where the story gets even more interesting. These animals weren't just sitting in cages being admired. They became characters in the political drama of European courts. When ambassadors visited, the menagerie tour was often part of the official schedule. Kings would strategically show certain animals to certain visitors, sending subtle messages. See this tiger? It was a gift from the Sultan. We have strong alliances in the East. Or, notice this elephant. We have the wealth and logistics to keep something this massive alive. Every animal was a talking point, a conversation starter, a piece of evidence in the ongoing negotiation of power. And sometimes the animals themselves became diplomatic gifts, passed from ruler to ruler like living letters. The King of Portugal sends an elephant to the Pope. The Caliph of Baghdad sends a lion to the King of France. The Sultan of Egypt sends a giraffe to the King of Spain. Each gift carried layers of meaning: gratitude, alliance, respect, intimidation, all of it encoded in the choice of animal. And the recipient had to respond appropriately, with gifts of equal or greater value. It was an entire language of diplomacy, conducted through creatures that couldn't speak a human word. So when we think about these early pet collectors, these original influences of the medieval and Renaissance world, we have to understand that this wasn't about love of animals in the way we might understand it today. This was about power, pure and simple. It was about demonstrating reach, wealth, control, and divine favour. It was about intimidation and alliance, about science and spectacle. These animals were living, breathing billboards that said, "I am powerful enough to bring the ends of the earth to my doorstep." And yet, I can't help but wonder about the individual moments. The emperor who genuinely marvelled at his elephant's intelligence, the noble lady who grew fond of her parrot's personality, the child who played with a pet monkey and simply saw a friend. Because humans, even in the midst of power games, form connections. And some of these relationships, as we'll discover throughout this journey, became genuinely remarkable. But that elephant standing in Charlemagne's courtyard in 802, he started something. He proved that the impossible could be made possible. And from that moment forward, European nobility would never stop trying to outdo each other, to find the next incredible creature, to push the boundaries of what could be owned and controlled. And speaking of pushing boundaries, if you think an elephant was impressive, wait until you hear about what happened when the nobility decided that monkeys should join them for dinner, literally, at the table, with place settings. Because in our next part, we're going to explore the primates who dressed in silk, learned to use silverware, and in one case shared a bed with one of history's most famous couples. Trust me, you won't believe where this story goes next. There's something deeply human about wanting to share your dinner table with those you care about. But what if the guest sitting across from you wasn't quite human? What if they arrived in a white dress, had excellent table manners, and happened to be covered in orange fur? Welcome to the world of primates in European palaces, where monkeys weren't just exotic pets. They became confidants, companions, political symbols, and sometimes the most scandalous members of the household. Let me take you back to England in 1525. Catherine of Aragon, Henry VIII's first wife, sits for a portrait. The artist is Lucas Horenbout, the official court painter, and this isn't going to be just any royal portrait. Because sitting with Catherine, wearing a little belt around its waist, attached to a long chain she holds delicately in her hand, is a Panamanian white-faced capuchin monkey. Now, you might be wondering why a queen would choose to be immortalized in paint with a monkey, and here's where it gets fascinating. This wasn't just about showing off an exotic pet. Every element in a Renaissance portrait carried meaning, layers of symbolism that contemporary viewers would have understood immediately. In Catherine's portrait, the monkey is reaching past a coin she's offering, stretching instead toward the jeweled crucifix hanging at her breast. The message? Faith over money, devotion over worldly wealth. And this was painted right when Henry was beginning the long, devastating process of trying to annul their marriage. So Catherine was making a statement. I cannot be bought. My marriage vows are sacred. But beyond the symbolism, there's a simpler truth. Catherine genuinely loved monkeys. They reminded her of home, of Spain, particularly the southern province of Andalusia, where she'd grown up before leaving for England in 1501. Can you imagine that? Being 16 years old, travelling to a foreign country, learning a new language, adapting to a completely different climate and culture. And then, years later, holding a creature that brought back memories of warmth and childhood and everything you'd left behind. That monkey wasn't just a status symbol, it was comfort. And Catherine wasn't alone in this affection. Her sister-in-law, Margaret Tudor, Queen of Scotland, also kept a monkey and was painted with it. Throughout Renaissance Europe, monkeys had become the must-have accessory for any noble household that wanted to be taken seriously. But here's the catch. Only the extremely wealthy could afford them. The logistics were staggering. These animals had to be captured in Central or South America or Africa or Asia, then survive a journey of thousands of miles by ship, often taking months. Most died on the voyage. Those that survived commanded astronomical prices, so when a noble lady appeared with a monkey on her shoulder, or a monkey sitting beside her in a portrait, she was broadcasting a very clear message. We have connections across oceans. We have wealth beyond measure. We have access to wonders. But let me tell you about someone who took the monkey as companion concept to an absolutely extraordinary level. Empress Josephine Bonaparte, Napoleon's first wife, and her orangutan named Rose. Picture this: Paris in the early 1800s, the Bonaparte household gleaming with imperial prestige, and living among them a young female orangutan, dressed in a white cotton chemise, who dined at the table with the emperor and empress, not kept in a cage, not chained in a courtyard, at the table. According to contemporary accounts, Rose had been meticulously trained by Josephine. She could use a knife and fork. Her table manners were reportedly better than those of many human guests. She had a particular fondness for turnips, which were served to her on fine china. And the rumours, scandalous as they were, suggested that Rose even slept in bed with Josephine and Napoleon. Can you imagine being a visiting diplomat, arriving for a state dinner and realizing that one of your fellow diners is an ape in a dress? The cognitive dissonance must have been overwhelming, and yet this was Josephine's world. She had an entire menagerie of exotic animals at their country estate, Malmaison. But Rose was special. Rose was family. Sadly, Rose didn't adapt well to the French climate or the indulgent lifestyle. Within a year of joining the Bonaparte household, she died. Josephine mourned her genuinely. But in an act that shows how these personal relationships intersected with scientific curiosity, Josephine donated Rose's body to the French scientist Georges Cuvier. He performed a detailed examination and published his findings in a work titled Description of an Orangutan and Observation of its Intellectual Faculties. So even in death, Rose contributed to human knowledge. But I can't help but wonder what Josephine thought, knowing her companion had become a subject of scientific study. Now let's travel north and back in time a bit, to the court of James I of England. His daughter, Princess Elizabeth Stuart, who would later become known as the Winter Queen of Bohemia, grew up surrounded by animals. Household records from her childhood reveal that she spent 8 shillings and 3 pence on strewing herbs and cotton to make beds for her Grace's monkeys, on mending parrots' cages, and on shearing her Grace's rough dog. 8 shillings and 3 pence. That doesn't sound like much until you realise that this was a recurring expense, and that it only covered bedding and cage repairs. The actual acquisition and feeding of these animals would have cost far more. Elizabeth didn't have just one monkey, she had multiple monkeys, and someone had to be employed specifically to look after them. In 1618, one of her ladies-in-waiting, Elizabeth Apsley, was officially given the responsibility of caring for Princess Elizabeth's monkeys at Heidelberg. The records refer to her as gouvernante to all the monkeys and dogs at the palace. Can you imagine having that as your job title? Royal Monkey Manager? and Elizabeth's affection for her monkeys lasted her entire life. Years later, living in exile in The Hague after her brief reign as Queen of Bohemia ended in political disaster, she still kept monkeys. She wrote letters to diplomats and military leaders, negotiating alliances and lobbying for support, and in those same letters she'd mention her monkey Jack, describing him as "knawish as ewer he was." That little detail tells us so much. In the middle of political turmoil, in the midst of trying to reclaim a kingdom, she still had affection and humour for her mischievous monkey companion. But not everyone found these primate housemates charming. There's a deliciously petty historical detail about Princess Elizabeth Stuart receiving a monkey house as a wedding gift from her new husband, Frederick V, in 1613. During the wedding ceremony at Westminster Abbey, the teenage bride couldn't stop giggling during her vows. Historians suggest it might have been because she was thinking about that absurd wedding present. A house for monkeys. What do you even do with that? And here's the thing about keeping monkeys as pets in medieval and Renaissance households. It was genuinely difficult. These are intelligent, social, curious creatures with a talent for causing chaos. They needed constant supervision. They would steal food, pull hair, knock over expensive vases, and generally wreak havoc. That's why, in most portraits showing monkeys, you'll notice they're wearing belts with chains attached. Catherine of Aragon's monkey had one. Most royal monkeys did. It's a stark reminder that for all the affection, for all the elaborate care, these were still wild animals being forced into human spaces. Medieval records talk extensively about the challenges of keeping monkeys. They needed to be chained to heavy blocks to prevent them from climbing everywhere and destroying things. That image is both sad and telling. On one hand, nobles genuinely cared for these animals, commissioned portraits with them, wrote about them with affection. On the other hand, they kept them in captivity, chained, unable to express natural behaviours. The cognitive dissonance is striking. How do you reconcile genuine love with such restrictive control? And the symbolism of monkeys in art shifted over time. In medieval thinking, monkeys often represented sin, foolishness, base desires. They were seen as crude imitations of humans, capable of mimicking but not understanding. So why would noble ladies want to be portrayed with them? Well, by the Renaissance, that symbolism had evolved. Monkeys came to represent worldliness, access to distant lands, scientific curiosity. They were proof that you were educated, well-travelled, connected, and in a world where women's power was severely restricted, having a monkey could be a subtle assertion. I may be confined to domestic spaces, but I have access to the exotic, the foreign, the wondrous. There's also something deeply poignant about women forming bonds with these animals. Think about the restrictions on noble women's lives. They couldn't travel freely. They couldn't choose their own husbands. Their primary value was in producing heirs. Their conversations were monitored. Their friendships were political. But a monkey? A monkey was uncomplicated companionship. A monkey didn't care about your position or your political usefulness. A monkey just existed alongside you, mischievous and honest in its needs. And let's talk about the sheer absurdity of some of these situations. Picture a formal state dinner in a European palace. Everyone in their finest clothes, multiple courses served on gold plates, orchestras playing in the background, and at the far end of the table, an orangutan in a white dress delicately using a fork to eat turnips. The cognitive whiplash between extreme formality and complete surrealism must have been constant. Or imagine being a servant in one of these households. Your job description includes things like make beds for monkeys using herbs and cotton, and chase the monkey when it steals food from the kitchen, and clean up after the monkey knocks over the ambassador's wine. It must have been simultaneously ridiculous and exhausting. But here's what I find most touching. Despite all the status signalling, despite all the political symbolism, I think there were genuine moments of connection. Catherine of Aragon holding her monkey's chain, finding comfort in something that reminded her of home. Josephine Bonaparte laughing at Rose's antics at the dinner table. Princess Elizabeth Stuart writing about Jack's mischievousness with obvious fondness. These weren't just possessions. They were relationships, however complicated. And those relationships came at a cost we haven't fully addressed yet. Every monkey in a European palace meant a mother in Africa or Asia or Central America who'd lost her baby. The method of capture was brutal. Hunters would often kill adult monkeys to capture the young ones, who were easier to transport and train. The mortality rate was devastating. For every monkey that successfully reached a European household, dozens died during capture or transport. And even those that survived rarely lived long in captivity. The climate was wrong, the diet was wrong, the social structure was wrong. Most died within a few years. So when we marvel at these historical accounts of monkeys at royal tables, we also have to sit with the uncomfortable reality of how they got there and what their lives were actually like. Dressed in silk, yes, fed from golden plates perhaps, but also chained, confined, living in completely unnatural conditions, separated from their families and their natural environments. The legacy of these royal primates is complex. They advance scientific understanding. Remember Rose contributing to Cuvier's research. They influenced art, appearing in countless portraits and paintings. They demonstrated the expanding reach of European exploration and trade. But they also represent the beginning of the exotic pet trade, a practice that continues to threaten wild populations today. Now, if you're thinking that monkeys were the only animals sharing intimate spaces with European nobility, well, you're in for another surprise. Because monkeys might have joined them for dinner, but there was one species of animal that did something even more remarkable. They didn't just observe royal life. They listened to every word. They sat on shoulders during the most sensitive conversations. They learned state secrets, and occasionally they repeated them. I'm talking, of course, about parrots, and the stories of royal parrots will absolutely blow your mind. If wolves could talk, the stories they'd tell would pale in comparison to what the parrots heard. Imagine being a bird sitting on a king's shoulder while he reads classified military reports. Picture yourself perched on the edge of a breakfast table, listening to diplomatic conversations about war and peace. Think about being present for every private moment, every heated argument, every secret whispered in what people thought was confidence. This was the life of royal parrots, and their story is absolutely extraordinary. Let me introduce you to Charlotte, an African grey parrot who knew more state secrets than most government ministers. The year is 1880-something. A young British naval officer, 17-year-old Prince George, is stationed in Port Said, Egypt, serving as a midshipman on the HMS Buccaneers. And in the bustling markets of this port city, he encounters a bird that will become his companion for decades. Some accounts say he purchased her. Others claim she was a gift from his sister Princess Victoria when he was 11. But regardless of how they met, Charlotte and George formed a bond that would last through his entire transformation from sailor prince to King George V. Now, here's where it gets fascinating. Charlotte wasn't kept in a cage like most pet birds. She had free reign of the palace. She would sit on the king's shoulder as he worked through his official red boxes, those leather cases containing state papers and confidential documents. Can you picture that? The king of the British Empire, ruler of a quarter of the world's population, with a parrot literally looking over his shoulder while he read military intelligence reports, diplomatic cables, cabinet minutes. Charlotte saw everything. And African grey parrots, as any bird expert will tell you, have exceptional memories and remarkable intelligence. But it gets better. Charlotte didn't just observe silently. She picked up the king's phrases, his mannerisms, his very voice. She would shout, "What about it?" in what contemporaries described as a stentorious voice, mimicking the king's own questioning tone. She knew nautical terms from his naval days. She even learned a smattering of French, because that was the diplomatic language of European courts, and she was trained to proclaim, "God save the King," which must have been both charming and slightly surreal during formal occasions. The king's grandson, George Lascelles, the Earl of Harewood, wrote about Charlotte in his memoirs The Tongs and the Bones. He described family breakfasts at Windsor Castle, where the children would come down to play quietly in the presence of the king, and there would be Charlotte sitting at a table by the king's side, eating seeds or an apple core, occasionally perching on people's hands. The Earl particularly remembered his mother's hand, with Charlotte's claws gripping firmly. He noted that children had to remain still because Charlotte could sense nervousness, and her claws were formidable, her beak awesome. But what I find most touching is what happened when King George fell gravely ill. Charlotte paced. She muttered. She called out repeatedly, "Where's the captain?" using the naval term the king had always preferred. It's one of those moments that makes you wonder about the emotional lives of birds, about what they understand, what they feel. And when the king recovered enough to receive visitors, Charlotte was the first guest he requested. She flew to his shoulder, danced, bobbed, and exclaimed, bless my buttons, all's well." One of the king's friends, Louis Greig, wrote letters describing Charlotte as the most privileged member of the household. He complained with obvious affection and exasperation that damned parrot is still weird and makes straight for me every morning at breakfast, even when I come in quite quietly and never speak to it at all. Anyone who's ever lived with a parrot will recognize this behavior. Parrots choose their people, and they make those preferences very, very clear to everyone else. When King George died in 1936, Charlotte was included in his funeral procession, a parrot, in a royal funeral, mourning her human companion of over 40 years. If that doesn't tell you something about the depth of their relationship, I don't know what would. But Charlotte wasn't alone in the world of royal parrots. Let's travel back a bit further to the young Princess Victoria, not yet Queen, receiving a gift from her uncle Ernest I, Duke of Saxe-Coburg-Gotha. It was May 1836, and Victoria was 17 years old. The gift was a lory, a type of parrot native to Australia and Indonesia, known for spectacular colouring and playful personalities. Victoria was enchanted. She wrote in her journal, and I love this description, "Dear Uncle Ernest made me the present of a most delightful lory, which is so tame that it remains on your hand, and you may put your finger into its beak, or do anything with it without its ever attempting to bite. It is larger than Mamma's grey parrot, and has a most beautiful plumage. It is scarlet, blue, brown, yellow, and purple. Scarlet, blue, brown, yellow, and purple. Can you imagine how that bird must have looked in the gaslit rooms of a 19th century palace? A living rainbow, a splash of tropical brilliance in the grey English climate. Victoria loved Laurie so much that she had him painted, twice. Once in a group portrait by Sir Edwin Landseer titled Her Majesty's Favourite Pets, painted in 1838, where Laurie appears alongside Dash the Spaniel, Nero the Greyhound, and Hector the Scottish deerhound. And then again, as a particular sign of royal favour, Landseer painted Laurie on his own, a portrait Victoria gave to her mother, the Duchess of Kent, as a gift. Think about that for a moment. A formal oil painting of a parrot, given as a meaningful present to the Queen's mother. That's how much this bird mattered. And Laurie wasn't Victoria's only parrot. Before him, she'd had a blue and green Brazilian parrot named Pedro. After him, she kept several African grey parrots who were highly trained. These birds could speak French, make jokes, and even toast the Queen's good health. Imagine being a dinner guest and having a parrot raise a metaphorical glass to Her Majesty. The Victorians must have been simultaneously delighted and bemused. But here's a question worth asking. Why were parrots so popular among European nobility? What made them different from all the other exotic pets we've discussed? Intelligence. That's the key. Parrots aren't just colourful decorations. They're among the most intelligent birds on Earth. African grey parrots, in particular, have cognitive abilities comparable to a 5-year-old human child. They understand cause and effect. They can count. They recognise themselves in mirrors, demonstrating self-awareness. They mourn their dead. And most remarkably, they don't just mimic human speech. They use it contextually. They understand, at least to some degree, what they're saying. So when Charlotte shouted, "Where's the captain?" during King George's illness, was she simply repeating a phrase she'd heard? Or did she understand in some bird way that something was wrong and she was calling for her companion? We can't know for certain, but anyone who's spent time with parrots will tell you there's something happening in those eyes, something that feels very much like understanding. There's also the longevity factor. Parrots live for decades. A well-cared-for African grey can live 50 to 60 years. Large macaws can reach 70 or 80. When you acquire a parrot, you're not just getting a pet. You're potentially getting a companion for your entire adult life. Charlotte was with King George for over 40 years. That's longer than many human friendships. That's longer than most marriages. She literally grew old with him. And then there's the element of interaction. Dogs are loyal and loving. Cats are affectionate on their own terms. But parrots? Parrots talk back. They have opinions. They make their preferences abundantly clear. They can be demanding, mischievous, stubborn, playful, tender. Living with a parrot is less like owning a pet and more like sharing your space with a very small, very opinionated roommate who happens to have wings. But let's be honest about something. For all the charm and companionship, keeping parrots in captivity comes with significant ethical concerns. In the wild, parrots live in large flocks. They fly dozens of miles every day. They have complex social structures. Keeping them in human homes, no matter how loving, is fundamentally restricting them. And in the 18th and 19th centuries, when all these royal parrots were being kept, there was zero understanding of proper parrot care, no specialized diets, no behavioral enrichment, no recognition that parrots need mental stimulation comparable to what young children need. Many parrots developed what we'd now recognize as psychological problems: feather plucking, screaming, aggression. These aren't signs of a difficult bird. These are signs of a highly intelligent creature suffering from boredom, loneliness, and confinement. And let's talk about the capture methods. Every parrot in a European palace meant a nest in Africa, Australia, or South America that had been raided. Often, adult parrots would be killed so their chicks could be taken, because young birds are easier to transport and train. The mortality rate during shipping was astronomical. Ships' captains learned to bring many more parrots than they needed, because most would die before reaching port. So when we admire the stories of Charlotte and Laurie, We also have to acknowledge the darker reality. These individual birds may have been loved and well treated, but the system that brought them to Europe was brutal, and it established patterns of exotic pet trade that continue to threaten wild parrot populations today. There's a particular poignancy in the image of Charlotte calling, "Where's the captain?" during King George's illness, because she was calling for her person, her companion, the centre of her world. But who was her person before she met George? Did she have a mate in Egypt, a flock, a life she was taken from? We romanticize these relationships, and maybe we should. Maybe Charlotte and George genuinely loved each other, in whatever way a human and a parrot can love. But we should also remember the cost. Yet despite all these ethical complexities, I can't help but be moved by the little details. A 2-year-old Princess Elizabeth, who would one day become Queen Elizabeth II, feeding sugar lumps to Charlotte. The image of that small child, carefully extending her hand to the elderly parrot who'd been her grandfather's companion since before her father was born. That's 4 generations of royal family, connected by one bird. Or Queen Victoria, 17 years old, delighting in the fact that she could put her finger in Laurie's beak without being bitten, marvelling at his rainbow colours. There's something so human in that moment. For all her future power and majesty, in that moment she was just a teenager, charmed by a beautiful bird. These parrots witnessed history. Charlotte was there through World War I, through the fall of empires, through the greatest geopolitical upheaval Europe had ever seen. She sat on the shoulder of a king who watched the old world die and a new one be born. What would she have said if she could have truly understood and reported what she'd observed? But perhaps the most remarkable thing about royal parrots is how they humanized their owners. Kings and queens, people often portrayed as distant and formal, would talk to their parrots, laugh at their antics, mourn their deaths. Charlotte made King George, a man described by his grandson as emotionally reserved, express genuine affection. That's no small thing. Now, parrots could listen and talk, but what about animals who could hunt? Because nobility didn't just want pretty companions or clever conversationalists, they wanted partners in the chase. And there was one animal that combined speed, beauty, danger, and usefulness in a way that absolutely captivated the European imagination. An animal so extraordinary that emperors would keep thousands of them. An animal that would eventually be loved nearly to extinction. Let me tell you about the cheetah craze and how the fastest land animal became the most coveted hunting partner in history. Speed. Pure, unmatched, breathtaking speed. That's what made cheetahs the most coveted hunting companions in history. 70 miles per hour. That's how fast a cheetah can run. 0 to 60 in 3 seconds, faster than most sports cars. And for centuries, the nobility of 3 continents built their entire hunting culture around this one remarkable ability. But what started as admiration became obsession, and obsession, as we'll see, nearly destroyed the very thing they loved. Let me take you to India in 1555. A 13-year-old boy named Jalaluddin Muhammad Akbar receives a gift that will change his life. An old courtier named Wali Beg presents him with a cheetah. Not just any cheetah. A trained hunting cheetah, already accustomed to human handlers, already skilled in the chase. The young Akbar names him Fatehbaz, which means victorious in battle. And from that moment forward, cheetahs become his passion, his obsession, his living symbol of power. Akbar would go on to become one of the greatest emperors in Indian history. His reign lasted from 1556 to 1605, nearly 50 years of expansion, consolidation, and cultural brilliance. and throughout all of it, cheetahs remained at the center of his world. But the scale of his collection was staggering in a way that's almost hard to comprehend. According to the Aini-Akbari, the detailed administrative chronicle written by his court historian Abul-Fazl, Akbar kept approximately 1,000 cheetahs at any given time. 1,000. Living, breathing, hunting cheetahs, each with their own handlers, each requiring daily care and training. But that's not even the most shocking part. Over the course of his 50-year reign, Akbar collected 9,000 cheetahs. 9,000. Let that number sink in for a moment. That's not 9,000 throughout history. That's 9,000 under one ruler in one lifetime. Think about the logistics. Every single one of those cheetahs had to be captured from the wild, transported, trained, housed, fed. An entire bureaucracy existed just to supply the emperor with cheetahs. Specific regions were designated as cheetah-catching territories. Professional trappers, many from a tribe called the Cheetahwala Pardi, made their entire living capturing these animals, and the capture methods were sophisticated. Early attempts involved deep pits, but cheetahs would often break bones falling into them, making them useless for hunting. Akbar, according to Abul-Fazl, personally pioneered a better method: shallow pits with trapdoors. The pits were only 2 to 3 gaz deep, just enough to trap the animal without injuring it, and the trapdoors were ingeniously designed to close behind the cheetah as it fell. The method was so effective that on one memorable occasion, 6 male cheetahs tumbled into the same pit one after another, all in pursuit of a female cheetah in heat who'd been used as bait. But why? Why did Akbar need so many cheetahs? Because cheetah hunting, called coursing, had become the ultimate aristocratic sport. Here's how it worked. The cheetah would be kept hooded, like a falcon, to keep it calm during the approach. Handlers would bring it close to the prey, usually black buck, antelope or gazelle. At the perfect moment the hood would be removed, and the cheetah would see the prey. Then, like releasing a living arrow, they'd unleash the cheetah, and the chase was on. A trained cheetah could reach speeds of 70 miles per hour within seconds. It would close the distance to the prey in a matter of heartbeats, using its distinctive dew claw to trip the running animal, then delivering a suffocating bite to the throat. The whole event, from release to capture, might take less than a minute. It was over almost before human observers could process what they'd seen. The sheer acceleration, the explosive power, the precision, it was unlike anything else in the natural world. And unlike with falconry, where the bird might be somewhat unpredictable, or with dogs, where the chase could last for miles, cheetah hunting was elegant, controlled, spectacular. It was speed made visible, it was violence rendered beautiful. But there was one cheetah who became legendary, even among Akbar's vast collection. His name was Chitta-Nanjan. In 1572, during a hunting expedition near what is now the Jaipur airport, Akbar unleashed Chitta-Nanjan to pursue a deer, and what happened next became the stuff of legend. The deer, running for its life, came to a ravine. A deep ravine 25 yards across. The deer leaped, clearing the gap in a desperate bound, and Chitta-Nanjan in his pursuit did the impossible. He leaped after it, soaring through the air to a height of a spear and a half, clearing the ravine, landing on the other side and seizing the deer. Akbar was so impressed, so absolutely stunned by this feat, that he immediately elevated Chitta-Nanjan's status. The cheetah was given a jewelled collar studded with precious stones, and in a gesture that might seem strange to us but made perfect sense in Mughal court culture, Akbar ordered that drums be beaten before Chitta-Nanjan, the way drums were beaten to announce the arrival of high-ranking nobles. This cheetah had earned honour, recognition, a kind of knighthood. Another of Akbar's favourite cheetahs was Madan Kali, described in contemporary accounts as so extraordinarily beautiful, so striking in appearance, that Akbar declared him the head of all cheetahs. Madan Kali didn't hunt. He sat right next to Akbar's throne, a living emblem of speed and grace, a constant reminder of the emperor's ability to command even the swiftest creatures on earth. But here's the tragedy hidden in all this magnificence. Every single one of those 9,000 cheetahs came from the wild. Because cheetahs, it turns out, almost never breed in captivity. They need vast territories, specific environmental cues, complex social interactions that simply don't exist in human care. Akbar tried. Oh, how he tried. He gathered male and female cheetahs together in gardens. He gave them space, privacy, everything he could think of. But they wouldn't mate. They couldn't in that artificial environment. Throughout Akbar's entire reign, with 1,000 cheetahs at a time, there's no record of successful breeding. Not one. The only documented case of a cheetah breeding in captivity in India happened decades later, during the reign of Emperor Jahangir, Akbar's son, in 1613, 1 litter, 1. And even that was considered miraculous, noteworthy enough to be recorded in the royal chronicles. So every cheetah in the Mughal menageries represented a cheetah taken from the wild. 9,000 captures under Akbar alone. And he wasn't the only one. Jahangir continued the tradition. He used cheetahs to capture over 400 antelopes in a single hunt near what's now New Delhi. Shah Jahan, Akbar's grandson, also hunted with trained cheetahs. The regional kingdoms of Rajasthan and central India all maintained their own cheetah collections, and this went on for centuries. The math is devastating. In the 16th century, there were an estimated 10,000 Asiatic cheetahs living wild in India. By the early 20th century, they were functionally extinct. The last 3 confirmed Indian cheetahs were killed by Maharaja Ramanuj Pratap Singh Deo of Korea in 1947. In 1952, the Indian government officially declared the cheetah extinct in the country. We loved them to death, literally. But the Mughals weren't alone in this practice. Cheetah hunting had been going on for millennia before Akbar. The ancient Egyptians were the first to train cheetahs for hunting, as early as 1550 BC. They appear in tomb paintings and hieroglyphics, collared and leashed, symbols of royal power. The practice spread from Egypt to Persia, where it became deeply embedded in court culture. Persian royal poetry from as early as 400 AD mentions kings hunting with cheetahs. By the 11th and 12th centuries, the fashion had reached Europe. Medieval Italy and France fell in love with cheetah hunting. Holy Roman Emperor Frederick II, that same emperor we mentioned earlier, who had cheetahs in his wedding procession, was an expert falconer and equally skilled with cheetahs. Charlemagne kept cheetahs. William the Conqueror had them. Throughout Renaissance Italy, every noble household aspired to own coursing cheetahs. And here's a detail that always strikes me as poignant. In 1513, when Pope Leo X was crowned, he received gifts befitting his new status: gold, jewels, precious manuscripts. And among those gifts, a trained cheetah, sent all the way from India, along with an Indian elephant. Because nothing said, "Congratulations on your papacy," quite like the fastest land animal on earth. The Duke of Cumberland in England imported 2 cheetahs from India in 1764, a full 12 years before the species was even formally described by Western science. These weren't called cheetahs yet. They were called hunting leopards, or sometimes just tigers, because Europeans didn't have a proper name for them, but they knew they wanted them. And then there's the painting. George Stubbs, one of England's greatest animal painters, immortalized these cheetahs in a work titled A Cheetah with Two Indians. The painting shows a cheetah, lean and alert, held on a leash by two Indian handlers in traditional dress. It's a beautiful painting. It's also a record of colonialism, of animals and people alike being transported to serve European aristocratic whims. But why did this practice eventually die out in Europe? Why did cheetah hunting disappear from European courts by the mid-17th century, even while it continued in India for another 300 years? Several reasons. First, European climate. Cheetahs, adapted to warm grasslands, didn't thrive in northern European winters. They got sick. They died young. Second, logistics. As we've established, cheetahs don't breed in captivity, so every cheetah had to be imported, and importing animals from India or Africa to France or Italy was extraordinarily expensive and had a very low success rate. But there's a third reason, and it's fascinating. European hunting culture began to shift. The Renaissance saw the rise of scientific thinking, systematic study of nature, and gradually the idea of keeping exotic animals in menageries evolved. Instead of wanting animals that hunted with you, nobles began wanting animals that could be observed, studied, displayed. The focus shifted from functional hunting companions to impressive exhibitions of diversity. Large animals like tigers and panthers, which looked more dramatic in cages, became more desirable than the sleeker, smaller cheetahs. So by the time the famous naturalist Buffon was writing in the 18th century, he'd never even seen a living cheetah. He'd only seen pelts, skins. The animal had been forgotten by European science, even though it had once been the darling of European courts. Meanwhile, in India, the tradition continued unabated, and then the British arrived. And the British, it must be said, made everything worse. They didn't just hunt with cheetahs, they hunted cheetahs. The colonial administration established bounty systems, 6 rupees for a cheetah cub, 18 rupees for an adult. Between 1870 and 1925, official records show an average of 1.2 cheetahs killed for bounty every year. That might not sound like much, but remember, by this point the population was already devastated. When you're down to perhaps a few hundred animals, removing even 1 or 2 a year from the breeding population is catastrophic. And the British didn't stop there. They also enthusiastically adopted the Mughal practice of hunting with trained cheetahs. They saw it as a way to ingratiate themselves with Indian royalty, to participate in authentic Indian culture. Except they didn't have the centuries of accumulated expertise that Indian handlers possessed. More cheetahs died in British care. More habitats were converted to agriculture. The remaining grasslands, already shrinking, were fragmented further by roads, railways, towns. The cheetah, which had survived for thousands of years, which had adapted to human hunting pressure, which had coexisted with multiple empires and dynasties, couldn't survive the combination of colonial exploitation and rapid modernization. By 1947, when India gained independence, only 3 were known to exist, and they were killed that same year. The irony is almost unbearable. The animal was beloved. Emperors wrote poems about cheetahs. Artists painted them with reverence and detail. They were given jeweled collars and honored with drums. They sat beside thrones. They were companions, not just tools. And yet that very love destroyed them. There's a Mughal painting from the 17th century that I think about often. It shows a family of wild cheetahs, the earliest known study of cheetahs in their natural habitat in India. The father relaxes in the foreground. The mother licks and suckles her cubs, who bound and play around her. The sky behind them is golden, warm, peaceful. It's a portrait of contentment, of natural life proceeding as it should. and it's almost impossible to look at without feeling grief, because that world is gone. Those peaceful families don't exist in India anymore. But here's something worth remembering. That painting wasn't created as a hunting trophy or a celebration of conquest. It was painted by a Mughal artist who simply observed and appreciated cheetahs as they were, which means that even within a culture that captured and used these animals, there was also recognition of their inherent value, their beauty in the wild, the capacity to see worth in something without needing to possess it. Maybe that's the lesson. Maybe the story of the cheetah craze is ultimately about the difference between admiration and appropriation, between appreciating something's magnificence and needing to control it. Because the cheetahs aren't completely gone. They survived in Africa, and now, in an interesting twist of history, India is attempting to reintroduce African cheetahs to Indian grasslands. In 2022, 8 cheetahs arrived from Namibia, the country with the world's largest cheetah population. It's an experiment, an acknowledgement of loss, an attempt at restoration. Time will tell if it works. But as we think about those 9,000 cheetahs that passed through Akbar's menageries, or the hundreds trained by medieval European nobles, or the countless others captured and used throughout history, maybe we can hold 2 truths at once. The relationships were real, the admiration was genuine, and the harm was devastating. Now, speaking of devastation and devotion existing side by side, there's a place we haven't visited yet. A place where the scale of royal animal collections reached heights that would make even Akbar's 9,000 cheetahs seem modest. I'm talking about Versailles under Louis XIV, where an entire architectural marvel was constructed for the sole purpose of displaying exotic creatures. And unlike everything we've discussed so far, this wasn't just about hunting or personal companionship. This was about creating a living museum, a testament to French power, and an early attempt at what we'd now call scientific study. Let's step into the most elaborate menagerie Europe had ever seen. Architecture can be a cage. But what if the cage itself was a masterpiece? 1663, the architect Louis Leveau receives a commission that will change the course of zoological history. King Louis XIV wants something no one has ever built before. Not just a collection of animals, not just enclosures scattered across royal lands, but a permanent, purpose-built, scientifically organized exhibition space where exotic creatures from every corner of the known world would live on display. A theatre of nature, a living museum, the first true modern menagerie, and Leveau delivers something extraordinary. At the southern end of what would become the Grand Canal at Versailles, on 9 acres of carefully manicured land, he designs an octagonal pavilion topped with a slate dome. Around this central building, 7 courtyards radiate outward like spokes of a wheel. Each courtyard specially designed for different species, each visible from the elevated first-floor balcony that wraps around the pavilion. Picture standing in that octagonal salon, windows on every side, and being able to observe flamingos in one direction, ostriches in another, gazelles to your left, exotic poultry to your right. It was revolutionary. The ground floor, decorated with shells to resemble a grotto, had a cool room with water features, offering visitors respite from summer heat while still surrounded by the sounds and sights of the animals. The upper floor featured paintings of animals by Nicasius Bernaerts covering the walls, so even when you weren't looking out the windows at living creatures, you were surrounded by artistic representations of them. It was immersive in a way nothing had been before. Construction was completed in 1664, and Louis XIV had created his first major project at Versailles, even before the Grand Canal was dug, even before the main palace underwent its massive expansion. That tells you something about his priorities. The menagerie wasn't an afterthought. It was a statement piece. It said, "I can bring the entire world to my doorstep. Look what I command." And the animals began arriving. Hummingbirds, so tiny and jewel-like that visitors could hardly believe they were real. Parrots in every colour imaginable. Cassowaries, those massive, dangerous birds from Madagascar with their brilliant blue heads and razor-sharp claws. The king of Madagascar sent one as a diplomatic gift, and courtiers would marvel at its size and temperament, equal parts fascinated and terrified. Ostriches, with their impossible height and speed. Dromedaries, camels with their distinctive single humps, walking reminders of desert lands most French nobles would never see. But the true stars were the elephants. In 1668, the King of Portugal, Pedro II, sent an extraordinary gift, a female African elephant from the Kingdom of Congo. She was 17 years old when she arrived, measuring 6.5 feet from ground to the top of her back, and she became the sensation of Versailles. Everyone wanted to see the elephant. Artists wanted to paint her. Scientists wanted to study her. Courtiers wanted to tell stories about her. The elephant lived at Versailles for 13 years. 13 years of being fed a rather bizarre diet that, looking back, might explain some things. Every single day this elephant consumed 80 loaves of bread. 80! Can you imagine the bakery operation required just for one animal? She also received vegetable soup with rice, grass, and here's the part that's absolutely wild, 12 litres of wine, every day. This elephant was drinking more than most French vineyard workers. Somehow, on this diet of carbs and alcohol, she survived for 13 years. Although she did become lame in her later years, and had to be supported by a crane to prevent her from collapsing. When she finally died in 1681, her death was considered a major scientific event. The Royal Academy of Sciences conducted a detailed dissection, studying her anatomy, documenting everything. Her skeleton was preserved and still exists today, although it now resides in the Museum of Natural History in Paris, a reminder of Versailles' past as a centre of zoological study. But the elephant wasn't the menagerie's only elephant. In 1772, during the reign of Louis XV, a second elephant arrived. This one was Indian rather than African, male rather than female, and his life at Versailles was even more tragic than his predecessors. The menagerie by this point had fallen into serious disrepair. The water systems flooded regularly, turning the courtyards into quagmires. The buildings were deteriorating. Maintenance had been neglected for decades. This elephant, arriving into a neglected and unsuitable environment, never thrived. He's remembered for one peculiar talent. He could open wine bottles with his trunk, a trick that delighted visitors but speaks to how bored and understimulated he must have been. And then, in 1782, he escaped his enclosure and drowned in the Grand Canal. The polluted Grand Canal. Whether he was trying to cool off, trying to escape, or simply lost his footing, we'll never know. But that death encapsulates everything wrong with how these animals were kept. Because here's the thing about the Versailles Menagerie. It was architecturally brilliant. It was scientifically pioneering. It inspired copycat menageries across Europe. Château de Chantilly in 1663, Hetloo Palace in the Netherlands in 1672, Belém Palace in Lisbon in 1726, Belvedere Palace in Vienna in 1716, Sanssouci Palace in Potsdam. The Schönbrunn Zoo in Vienna, opened in 1752, directly copied Lavau's radial design. The Versailles Menagerie created the template for modern zoos, but it was also deeply flawed. The focus was on display, not animal welfare, on spectacle, not habitat, on what looked impressive to human visitors, not what the animals actually needed. And as the decades passed, as Louis XIV aged and lost interest in his exotic pets, as Louis XV largely ignored the menagerie, as Louis XVI inherited a crumbling facility he didn't have the resources or inclination to fix, the animals suffered. Let me take you through the decline, because it's both fascinating and heartbreaking. During Louis XIV's life, the menagerie was immaculate. The king loved strolling there with favoured courtiers. He'd arrive by boat, sailing down the Grand Canal, making an entrance. Animals were gifts from governors and ambassadors competing for royal favour. The governor of Madagascar sent not just that cassowary, but also rare birds and lemurs. The East India Company, on their return voyages from Asia, Africa and the Americas, brought back creatures for the royal collection. One particularly dedicated animal procurer, a man named Montagnon, made approximately 40 trips between 1671 and 1694, travelling to North Africa and the Middle East. He brought back more than 800 birds, including 103 ostriches in various shipments, plus exotic gazelles, goats, and sheep. Just imagine coordinating the logistics of transporting 103 ostriches across the Mediterranean. The mortality rate must have been staggering. But then Louis XIV started aging. By the time he was approaching 60, he'd grown tired of exotic animals. The novelty had worn off, so in 1698 he had the menagerie renovated and enlarged by Jules Ardouin Mansart, and then he gave it away, as a gift, to his grandson's 12-year-old wife, Marie Adélaïde of Savoy, Duchess of Burgundy. Now this might sound cruel, giving a child responsibility for an entire zoo. But Marie Adélaïde apparently loved it. She used the menagerie as an afternoon residence, a place to escape the rigid formality of court life. She had a pleasure garden added, that cool room with water features was maintained, and she even had a chapel built on the grounds. For a young woman trapped in the goldfish bowl of Versailles court life, the menagerie represented freedom, a place where she could be herself.
Dear friends, if this story brought you even a little peace tonight, just imagine how many more relaxing bedtime stories are waiting for you on this channel. So, please like this video, share it with someone who also loves calm stories, and don't forget to subscribe to join our family. Make sure to turn on the notification bell so you'll be the first to know whenever a new story is uploaded. And now, YouTube has introduced something new. It's called hype. By giving our channel a little hype, you can help us reach so many more people who need rest and relaxation. Your support truly means the world. Finally, let us know in the comments how tonight's story felt for you. Every single word of feedback inspires us to create more magical bedtime journeys. Sweet dreams, and see you again in the next story.